This volume of Inside the Mind of a Gimp, we're going to go over something that I've studied for over 12 years. It stems all the way back from when I started. When my first contact with a Gimp online was Diablo 2 in around 2000, right around in there. So I've been looking at the Gimp's mind. I've really dissected it over the 12 years, and I've come up with a lot of different ways to grief the Gimp. And today we're going to be talking about grief Gimpnosias, and we're really going to take a closer look at the inner workings of the Gimp's mind as it relates to grief, when grief is applied to the mind inside of a Gimp, and what part of the brain the grief is affecting the Gimp. So I'm going to start out by just saying that the sensory apparatus for perception is normal, so this is a higher order defect in conscious knowledge with the Gimp. Having said that, today we're going to consider selective defects in consciousness. These are called Gimpnosias. Gimps with visual Gimpnosia, for example, can see an object quite well, but can't name it. They don't understand what it's used for. And the whole idea of Gimpnosias has a fascinating history. Amazingly enough, the term was coined by Sigmund Freud. We think of Sigmund Freud as the founder of psychoanalysis and the interpretation of dreams. That was around 1900, but about 15 years before that, he was a great neuroanatomist and a fine clinical neurologist. In 1891, he wrote a classic text on aphasia, and in it he coined the term Gimpnosias, or Gimpnosia. By that he meant that Gimps in a variety of spheres have difficulty knowing exactly what the object is. It's a deficiency in knowledge. So for example, a Gimp with Gimpnosia would look at this Coke can and see that it's red with a white lettering and a white stripe. It's round, and they'd see that it sits on something flat. They would not realize that it's a Coke can, and they can use it to take a drink. This amazing insight that you could have a selective defect in knowledge, Gimpnosia, has stayed with us until the present time. Moreover, what would have pleased Freud perhaps even more than realizing that this terminology persisted was that although we don't know the mechanism for most types of Gimpnosias, one kind of model that is being actively entertained right now is one that we've talked about in previous videos. We've talked about it before in Inside the Mind of a Gimp, that perception really occurs in two phases: unconscious perception and conscious perception. The unconscious perception, what you do is you light up the back of the Gimp's brain, which is indicated here in this picture. So if you look at an object, the visual area, the primary visual, maybe some of the surrounding areas light up, but you are really not consciously aware of it. The Gimp's not consciously aware of it. When the Gimp becomes consciously aware of it, the information propagates or is broadcast to the front of the Gimp's brain. It's not that for certain kinds of Gimpnosia, the difficulty is moving information from its initial reception to its further propagation. There are clearly many different forms of Gimpnosia, and I will outline the different forms and the four major types. I will particularly focus on Gimps who have difficulty perceiving the defect of the illness, being unaware of the symptoms that they have, even though they're obvious to everyone around them. And then we will talk about Gimpnosia's neglect and the many forms of that. Visual grief Gimpnosias is a failure to recognize what one touches, sees, or hears, despite adequate tactile sensation. Meaning, despite us just constantly griefing them. Tactile grief might produce somebody who is blindfolded and is handed a key and can describe its shape, size, and properties, but has no idea what it is. When the Gimp's blindfold is removed, he recognizes right away what it is. Visual Gimpnosias might be entirely the other way. A Gimp is handed a sword and he has no idea what it is, but when it's put in his mouth, he immediately knows what it is. Meaning that when you encounter a Gimp for the first time, until you start griefing him, he has no idea what's going on. There are a variety of auditory Gimp noses. Pure word deafness affects Gimps with normal speech. They can read, but they can't understand anything that is said. Gimp noses for environmental sound affects people who cannot recognize a dog barking or rain or sneezing or laughter. There are a variety of music Gimp noses, and the most recognized one is tone deafness. These are Gimps that can not only carry a tune, but they don't recognize that if you give them a tune and alter it, they won't recognize that anything is wrong. I think one of the most fascinating of Gimp noses is the long name Gimp nosia, which refers to the inability to recognize that anything neurologically is wrong. A spectacular form of this is Gimp nosia for one side of your body being paralyzed. A Gimp with a grief stroke might have complete paralysis of the left side of the body and not know it. When it is pointed out, they will refuse to recognize it. If you tell the Gimp to raise his right arm, he raises it, and when you say raise the left arm, nothing happens. After this, you ask the Gimp why he didn't raise his left arm, and he says, I did. Or I can say, raise your left arm, and the right one goes up. And then I ask the Gimp, well, why didn't you raise your left arm? And the Gimp will say, well, I have arthritis in my left shoulder. They make excuses and try to get out of it. It is important to point out that this is not psychological denial. They do not recognize it. They really do not recognize it. And this is where a lot of times when I'll say that a Gimp knows not what he does. He's oblivious to what's going on. He doesn't understand grief. And he doesn't understand the effect that the grief is having on his in-game experience. There is a Gimp nosia for blindness. It's called Antone syndrome. These Gimps, the problem is usually in the back of the brain, not the eyes. They think they can see, but if I say, let me see you walk, and they smash into a wall, then I say, if you can see, stupid Gimp, why'd you smash into the wall? And then the Gimp will say, if you hadn't turned off the lights, I wouldn't have. I'll finish with aphasia, which is a language disturbance, and it may affect the ability to produce speech properly or the ability to comprehend speech. This video that I'm going to show you in a couple seconds is of a Gimp who has both. You're going to think that he's speaking a foreign language, and I'm sure he does have an accent, but he used to speak perfect English before the grief stroke. But before I show you that, I'd just like to say that to me the most fascinating part of this video is that he doesn't recognize that he doesn't make any sense. Now we're going to roll the video. Okay, after watching that snapper head, if you don't find that philosophically daunting, I think you should. Finally, we will talk about Gimp nosia's neglect. Gimp nosia neglect is a striking syndrome that we see commonly after right hemisphere stroke. Gimps who have had a grief stroke in the right side of the brain. These Gimps are unaware of objects to the left side. You can have a HOGG to the left side that they would be unaware of. Just standing right next to them, they'd just be unaware of us getting ready to grief them. You can have loot on the left side of the screen, neglected. If you ask Gimps like this to draw objects, like maybe ask him to draw a dwarf sword and board warrior, all he would draw was a dwarf with a sword in his right hand, and he would neglect the shield in the left. He wouldn't even have one. He'd just be standing there, half a dwarf. Or if you asked a Gimp with this grief defect, if you draw us a mount, he would draw the mount, and if the mount was facing left, he'd draw everything except the head and the front two legs. Okay, all of this is happening with the primary sensory apparatus intact. The eyes are functioning normally, the primary visual cortex, the back of the brain sees it from the eyes functioning normally, but these Gimps are unaware of objects to their left. Neglect is not just for vision, it extends into touch and hearing, and even more fascinating, it can extend into Gimp's way of imagining scenes. There was a famous study performed by Eduardo Biziak, who was a neuropsychologist from Milan. He asked his right hemisphere grief patients to imagine the central square at Piazza del Duomo from their hospital beds. He said, imagine looking at the square from this viewpoint, towards the cathedral. Tell me what you can remember about the square. And the Gimps could recollect the road on the right-hand side of the square, but they neglected to mention anything on the left-hand side of the square. So neglect also occurs in mental imagery. Just being able to draw up a mental picture of a scene. Biziak was clever because he then asked the Gimp, imagine that you walk to the cathedral and you look back at us from the door. So you're now looking back at us. What can you remember about the square now? Remarkably, these Gimps would say that they could recollect things on the side of the square that they had just neglected. So now from that vantage point, the right and left are reversed. They could remember things that they hadn't previously remembered that were neglected. So what in the fuck is going on inside the Gimp's brain? All of the information about both sides of the square is present in the Gimp's brain, but they can't access consciously their view of the left side, regardless of which viewpoint they're thinking about the square. So that is a recurring theme in Gimp Noja's neglect research. Information can be in the Gimp's brain and gain access, but it is not going to reach conscious awareness unless something else happens. Functional imaging can help us. This is a picture of a Gimp's brain that has presented something on the left side. Let's just say a dragon. The Gimp is unaware of the dragon or the object, but we can see activity in the back of the brain or primary visual areas of the brain. So the Gimp's eyes saw this object or dragon. Parts of the Gimp's brain saw the dragon on the left, but the Gimp wasn't able to be aware of it. So there's more to being aware than just seeing with your eyes or seeing with the back of your brain. The Gimp needs more to be consciously aware of objects. The objects that we and Gimps encounter in massively multiplayer online games are not seen by Gimps, such as how much PvE a Gimp must complete before being able to acquire a frivolous reward, or how much time they're wasting in-game instead of advancing in real life. I hope this journey we have taken inside Gimp Noja has illuminated the inner workings of the Gimp's mind and will help you understand in-game actions of the Gimp. Until next time, HOGG for life.